She liked to think the world saw her as untouchable, almost carved from marble, but Duchess Isolde carried a heart that beat far louder than her manners allowed. Inside those towering golden halls, people whispered her name with admiration, sometimes envy, sometimes awe. They saw the elegance, the poise, the way she moved as if her feet never really touched the ground. What they didn't see was the weight she had learned to carry so quietly. Every day she woke inside a palace that glittered like a jewel box, yet felt colder than winter stone. And honestly, she wondered how long a woman could shine without burning out completely. From a distance, her life looked like a dream spilled onto silk. Servants glided through corridors at her command. Chandeliers sparkled above her like constellations arranged just for her, and courtiers bowed with the kind of reverence that could make anyone feel immortal. But Isolde felt none of that magic. Not anymore. Behind each gesture of grace, there lingered a quiet ache, the kind that settles deep when love is nowhere to be found. Her marriage to Duke Edrin was the very definition of duty wrapped in ice, and every morning, she felt that frost seeping a little deeper into her bones. Duke Edrin, with his imposing stature and calculating stare, treated affection as if it were a currency too expensive to give. To the world, he was powerful, disciplined, admirable. To Isolde, he was a man shaped entirely by ambition, with no space left for warmth. She had once believed she could endure it, but now, each passing day revealed another crack in the gilded life she had been forced to uphold. Inside her, something restless stirred. Something bold and dangerously alive. She didn't dare name it yet, but she felt it. An awakening, a pulse urging her toward possibilities she knew could change everything, and possibly destroy much more. Anyone watching Isolde glide through the court would swear she'd mastered the art of serenity, but beneath that calm exterior lived a woman constantly measuring every breath. The court was a maze of velvet smiles and sharpened intentions. A place where every compliment hit a blade. She moved through it with practiced precision, her eyes soft, her voice warm, her posture impeccable. Yet inside, she felt the air growing thinner by the day. It was the kind of quiet suffocation that didn't make noise, only left invisible bruises on the spirit. And each time she felt it tightening around her, the spark inside her flared just a bit brighter. There were moments when she caught her reflection in the polished marble floors, moments that made her pause. She didn't always recognize the woman staring back. That face had learned to hide too much. The loneliness, the disappointment, the dreams she had set aside so carefully they'd begun to gather dust. But lately, those long-buried dreams had started whispering again. They rose in quiet waves whenever she watched the moon through her window, or when she overheard laughter from the servants' quarters. She envied the simplicity of that laughter. She envied the freedom hidden inside it. And so, night after night, while the palace slept under layers of silence, Isolde found herself pacing her private chamber like a caged pulse. She knew the walls too well, the way they echoed her steps, the way they held her secrets without offering any comfort in return. Her marriage had boxed her in, her status had chained her, and the life she lived was beginning to feel like a sentence she'd never agreed to serve. Something had to change. She felt it deep in her chest, as undeniable as her own heartbeat. And once a woman starts to question the cost of her constraints, the world around her begins to shift in ways no one can predict. In rare moments of stillness, Isolde let herself revisit fragments of the woman she once hoped to become. Not a duchess locked behind protocol, but someone who could choose her own path without asking permission from a man who barely looked her in the eyes. She remembered being younger, laughing loudly, dreaming boldly, believing her future would be shaped by love rather than obligation. Those memories felt like warm hands pressed against her cold life, reminding her she had once been more than a symbol draped in gold. And every time those memories surfaced, they lit a fuse inside her, a fuse she wasn't sure she could keep from burning. Sometimes, when Duke Edrin returned late from the council chambers, smelling of ink and politics, Isolde studied him the way one studies a locked door, curious, frustrated, always calculating the cost of trying to open it. There were nights she tried to speak to him, offering gentle tones or thoughtful questions, hoping for a spark of connection, but his responses were clipped, practiced, hollow. It wasn't hatred between them. That might have been easier. It was something colder, a distance so vast she couldn't remember a time when she hadn't been standing alone on her side of it. And that loneliness, disguised under silk and jewels, became its own kind of hunger. One evening, as she stood on her balcony overlooking the dark gardens, the wind carried a chill that felt strangely like a warning and an invitation. She felt her pulse thrum with a clarity she hadn't felt in years, as if some invisible line had finally snapped. This life, gilded and suffocating, was no longer something she could simply endure. She needed a way out, a way forward, something daring enough to break the cage she'd been told to call home. And the thought that rose within her was frightening, intoxicating, and far too loud to ignore. It was the kind of thought that would soon lead her toward a shadow waiting just beyond the palace walls. Kale had a reputation that traveled faster than his footsteps ever could. People spoke his name in cautious hushes, as if saying it too loudly might summon him from the shadows he called home. He moved like someone who'd spent a lifetime learning the language of danger, understanding its rhythm, its scent, its silent promises. And yet, beneath that steel exterior, there lived a man carved by solitude, shaped by choices that left little room for softness. He didn't crave fear or power. He craved purpose. Purpose, and maybe, though he'd never admit it, a place where he didn't feel invisible. The night he first crossed paths with Duchess Isolde, the air felt charged, almost brittle. She stood cloaked beneath the dim glow of lantern light, her posture unwavering, her eyes steady, as though she were meeting an old friend rather than a man known for ending lives. Kyle noticed the subtle tremor in her breath, the way she held it, not out of fear, but resolve. That alone startled him. He had met clients before, desperate, angry, vengeful, but never a woman bathed in quiet elegance who looked at him like she recognized the loneliness behind his armor. And in that moment, he felt something shift in him, something he didn't welcome, but couldn't avoid. Isolde spoke with a calm he instantly admired, offering a fortune that could buy him a new destiny. But what caught Kale off guard was not the gold, or the escape she promised. It was the way she spoke to him, not as a weapon to be wielded, but as a person with a heartbeat, with history, with wounds. She saw more than she should have, more than he liked, and yet he didn't turn away. Instead, he listened, really listened, and in doing so, he sensed the danger curling between them. Not just the danger of the task she proposed, but the danger of feeling drawn to a woman who had every reason to ruin him, and every reason to need him. The air around them thickened with unspoken questions, each one hovering just long enough to unsettle Kale's usually steady mind. He wasn't used to hesitating. Decisions for him were swift, clean, absolute. But something about Isolde's presence tugged at the parts of him he kept locked away. She spoke of her life with a quiet restraint, revealing only glimpses of the cage she lived in, yet each glimpse carried the weight of years. Kyle recognized that kind of burden. It echoed too closely to his own, and for a man who preferred distance, that familiarity felt far more dangerous than any blade. Isolde, in turn, watched Kale with a mix of fear and a strange, fragile hope. She sensed the storm inside him, the conflict between the duty he had always known and the unexpected pull he felt toward her story. Every time his gaze lingered, she felt her pulse quicken, not in terror, but in the startling realization that she wasn't as alone as she had believed. She chose her words carefully, weaving truth with vulnerability, allowing him to glimpse the woman beneath the title. In doing so, she revealed a courage she hadn't expected to find within herself. And with each word she offered, she silently wondered if she was stepping toward salvation or disaster. Their conversation became a thread connecting two worlds that weren't meant to touch. Kale measured each breath, each promise, each flicker of emotion that crossed her face. He had heard pleas before, but Isolde's carried something raw, something stirring. She wasn't begging. She was reclaiming a part of herself she feared losing forever. And Kale, for reasons he couldn't fully name, felt a pull to protect that spark. The pact forming between them was more than a transaction. It was the beginning of a storm neither of them could see clearly, but both could feel rumbling on the horizon. When Kale finally agreed to her proposal, the moment hung between them like a held breath. Neither dared release. His voice was low, steady, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil twisting inside him. He wasn't just accepting a job. He was stepping into a path laced with consequences he could already taste. Isolde felt something tighten in her chest, a mix of relief and fear, because she knew the choice he'd made was as dangerous for him as it was for her. And in that instant, A silent understanding passed between them, fragile but unmistakable. They were bound now, not by loyalty or trust, but by a shared ache for change. As they parted ways, the night seemed to shift around them, as though the shadows themselves had taken notice. Kyle watched her disappear into the darkness, her cloak trailing behind her like a whisper of the life she was desperate to escape. He felt a heaviness settle on his shoulders, not the familiar weight of obligation, but something more personal, something unsettling. She had stirred memories of the boy he once was, the one who still believed in second chances before the world taught him they were illusions. And now, that old longing resurfaced, prickling against the man he had become. Isolde, returning to her silent palace, felt her heartbeat drumming with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not entirely. It was a fragile spark of hope, wild and reckless, alive in a way her life had not allowed for a very long time. She knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross, and yet she felt strangely steadied by it. The pact she made was a step toward freedom or ruin, but for the first time, she wasn't standing alone at the edge. Something had shifted, something had begun, and the ripple of that choice was already weaving itself into the walls around her. Kyle slipped into the Duke's world, the way a shadow slips across a candle flame, quiet, unnoticed, but capable of changing everything. He moved through corridors, courtyards, and crowded halls with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime studying the art of invisibility. From behind pillars and latticed windows, he watched Duke Edrin with sharp, calculating eyes. Every gesture, every controlled breath, every interaction meant something, and the more he observed, the more he felt a quiet tug of uncertainty deep in his chest. People were rarely as simple as their reputations. Even the coldest monsters had cracks somewhere. Meanwhile, Isolde walked through the same castle with a mask she had perfected long before Kale's arrival. She smiled when expected, nodded when required, and played the role of dutiful duchess with the elegance of a seasoned performer. Yet beneath that polished exterior, a storm churned, desire for freedom, guilt for what she had set in motion, and a growing connection to the man hiding in the shadows for her sake. Each time footsteps echoed behind her, she felt a flicker of fear that someone might see past her facade, and every time she felt Kale's distant presence, her heart tightened with a complicated blend of comfort and danger. But the court was not blind, not entirely. Whispered rumors began threading their way through the corridors, carried by servants who noticed too much and advisors who trusted too little. A chambermaid once lingered near Isolde's door longer than she should have, her eyes narrowing at faint traces of a conversation that didn't belong. A knight paused when he found footprints where none should be, and though no one had proof, suspicion grew like a vine, quiet at first, then hungry. Isolde felt it, Kyle sensed it, and beneath their separate facades, they both knew the delicate web around them was beginning to tremble. Isolde felt the tension tightening around her like a ribbon pulled too hard. Every glance from the Duke's advisors seemed sharper, probing, as if they were searching for a loose thread in her composure. She had mastered the art of measured breathing, of smiling with her eyes while her heart sprinted beneath layers of silk. But lately, even her most graceful smiles felt thin. Her mind kept drifting to Kale, somewhere in the walls, the courtyards, the shadows. Knowing he was near steadied her, yet terrified her just the same. Because with every passing day, the risk wasn't just about the plan being exposed, it was about them being exposed. Kale, too, felt the pressure mounting. He had seen suspicion before. It carried a scent, a shift in the air, a certain rhythm to footsteps that suddenly slowed around corners. The Duke's closest men had started to linger in hallways Kale had already mapped as safe. Their eyes darted where they hadn't before, and their hands hovered near hilts a heartbeat too long. Every instinct told Kale the window of subtlety was shrinking, but what unsettled him most wasn't the danger. It was the nagging question of whether Isolde had told him everything. There were moments when her words replayed in his mind, and certain details didn't quite fit together, and that doubt began threading through him like a splinter. One evening, as Kale watched Edrin from a distance, he felt something unexpected prick at his certainty. The Duke stood alone on a balcony. No audience, no advisors, just a man staring at the gardens with a heaviness Kale recognized all too well. There was no cold calculation in Edrin's posture then, no arrogance, only a quiet loneliness that didn't match the story Isolde had painted. And that single, fragile moment unsettled Kale deeply. Because if the Duke wasn't the villain Isolde believed, or claimed, then Kyle needed to question not just the mission, but the woman he was risking everything for. Isolde felt cracks forming beneath her calm exterior, the kind that didn't break loudly, but widened with every unanswered question. She could sense the advisors circling closer, their polite nods turning into lingering stares, their whispers thinning into silence whenever she passed. Even the servants moved differently around her, as if afraid to be caught too near her shadow. At night, she lay awake, fingers tracing the embroidered patterns on her sheets while her mind spiraled into fear. What if someone had seen something? What if Cale had been noticed? And worst of all, what if her plan was slipping beyond her control before she'd taken her first real step toward freedom? Cale, hidden in the architecture like a phantom stitched into stone, noticed the shift as well. He saw the tightened patrol routes, the hushed exchanges, the subtle yet unmistakable unease threading through the Duke's inner circle, and with each observation, he felt the weight of doubt pressing harder on his chest. He had trusted Isolde's desperation, but had he trusted her story? He wanted to believe her, wanted to see her as the trapped soul she portrayed. Yet every time he glimpsed the Duke alone, quiet, contemplative, human, it unsettled the narrative he'd been given. Cale knew lies when he heard them. Half-truths were even more dangerous. The palace, once merely cold, now felt alive with suspicion, as if every wall had grown an ear and every floorboard a conscience. Isolde sensed it breathing down her neck. Cale sensed it stalking him through corridors, and both felt the tightening of a web they'd helped weave. One wrong move, one misplaced glance, one overheard whisper could unravel everything. And beneath their shared tension churned something deeper, something more fragile, a connection that, if discovered, could doom them faster than any conspiracy. And as the threads of trust and fear twisted tighter between them, the night that would test them both began drawing closer, step by inevitable step. The night that had lingered in their thoughts for weeks finally arrived, heavy and electric, as if the sky itself sensed what was coming. The palace, usually humming with routine, seemed to hold its breath. Torches flickered with restless flames, and every shadow stretched just a little farther than it should. Isolde felt the air pressing against her skin, cool and sharp, while her pulse beat like a secret drum beneath her ribs. She had imagined this moment 100 different ways, each one filled with certainty and purpose. But standing in the midst of it, she felt the tremor of fate brushing against her spine, whispering that nothing would unfold the way she expected. Somewhere beyond the tapestry-lined corridors, Kyle moved with a precision carved from years of survival. His senses sharpened, recording every sound, the scrape of a guard's boots, the distant murmur of voices, the faint click of metal settling in the cold air. Tonight wasn't like the others. Tonight carried a different weight, a different silence, the kind that clung to him like a warning. He had come prepared for danger, but not for the storm of questions still tugging at the back of his mind. Questions about the Duke, about Isolde, about the truth that didn't quite fit the lines he'd been given. And the Duke, unaware or pretending to be, stood in the flickering light of his study, surrounded by papers, maps, and the remnants of a life built on duty. There was something almost fragile in the way he rubbed his temples, as though he were fighting ghosts only he could see. He looked less like a tyrant tonight, and more like a man carrying a burden too great for one heart, a burden Cale couldn't ignore. And as the clocks ticked toward the moment that would change all their lives, the fragile threads connecting them began to tighten, ready to snap or bind in ways none of them could yet understand. Isolde's steps were slow, almost reverent, as she approached the heart of the palace where the night's truth waited to unfold. Her gown whispered against the stone floors, a soft sound swallowed quickly by the weight of the moment. Every inch of her felt alive, her breath, her heartbeat, the cold air brushing her skin. She had spent years navigating a life built on silence, but tonight the silence felt different. It felt watchful. Her mind raced through every memory of Duke Edrin, every expression she had misread, every warning she had ignored, and beneath all of it, fear mingled with something she hated to admit, uncertainty. Kyle reached the edge of the Duke's private corridor and paused, letting the shadows settle around him like a cloak. He had always trusted the shadows. They never lied, never pretended, never changed their nature. But tonight, even they felt unpredictable. He studied the hallway, noting details with the precision of a man who had survived by knowing what others overlooked. But what held him frozen wasn't a guard or a trap. It was the echo of the Duke's voice drifting through the heavy door, low, tired, carrying a weight Kyle had never heard. It was the sound of a man burdened by more than ambition, and it made Kyle question everything Isolde had told him. Inside the room, Edrin spoke softly to someone unseen, perhaps himself, perhaps a memory. His words carried regret, a kind that didn't match the cold figure Isolde had described. Kyle leaned closer, listening to fragments about failed promises, fractured trust, and a woman he had tried but never learned how to reach. The crack in Kyle's convictions widened. If Edrin wasn't the villain, then what was he? And if Isolde had bent the truth, just enough to spark sympathy, just enough to justify desperation, what else had she hidden? Kale felt the truth hovering just out of reach, waiting to reshape the night in ways none of them were prepared for. Isolde reached the doorway just as the weight of her choices settled fully onto her shoulders. She placed a hand against the cool wood, steadying herself, her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. The hall behind her felt endless, stretching into a past she no longer wished to belong to, while the room before her threatened a future she couldn't yet see. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself feel everything: fear, hope, guilt, and that quiet, piercing desire to finally reclaim her life. But beneath all those emotions, something darker stirred, a whisper of ambition she had tried so hard to ignore. Kale spotted her from the shadows, her silhouette framed by the faint lantern glow. There was a fragility in the curve of her shoulders he had never seen before, as if she too was breaking under the weight of secrets neither of them had fully spoken aloud. He stepped closer, silently, instinctively, drawn not by duty, but by something dangerously human. He wanted to protect her, from the guards, from the Duke, from the consequences of this night. Yet a sharper part of him wondered if he needed to protect himself from her. Trust was a blade, after all, sharp enough to wound the one who held it. Then, a sound from inside, the scrape of a chair, the shift of a breath, pulled both of them taut. The Duke was no longer alone in his regret. He had sensed something in the air, something stirring beyond the door. Isolde swallowed the knot in her throat, her fingers trembling just once before she forced them still. Kale's hand drifted toward his hidden blade, unsure whether he would be defending a truth, ending a lie, or confronting something neither of them had anticipated. And in that suspended heartbeat, the fragile balance between loyalty, deception, and longing tilted, ready to send them all crashing into the moment that would reveal what lived behind the stories they had told. The moment the door swung open, the world seemed to narrow into a single, breathless instant. The Duke stood framed in the dim light, his expression unreadable. Neither fury nor fear, but something far more haunting. He looked from Isolde to Kyle, with an understanding that chilled them both. It was the look of a man who had known the truth long before they dared whisper it, a man who had waited for the storm rather than run from it. Isolde's breath caught, her heart pounding in a painful rhythm. This wasn't the confrontation she had imagined. It was quieter, heavier, as if the night itself had paused to witness the breaking point of their tangled fates. Kyle stepped forward, instinct guiding him more than reason. His blade remained hidden, but every muscle in his body thrummed with the readiness to protect or to end, depending on what the next heartbeat demanded. Yet when he met Edrin's eyes, he froze. There was no arrogance there, no threat, only a tired resignation, the kind carried by someone who had lived too long with unspoken truths. And in that silence, Kyle felt the ground shift beneath him. Had he been fighting the wrong battle all along? Had he been pulled into a story shaped not by lies, but by wounds neither of them had fully understood? Isolde felt the weight of Edrin's gaze like a hand pressing against her chest. For years, she had painted him as distant, cold, unreachable. But seeing him now, steady, wounded, strangely human, unraveled something inside her. Memories flashed, conversations she dismissed, small gestures she ignored, the walls she built long before he ever did. And suddenly, the question she had buried beneath ambition clawed its way to the surface. Had she sought freedom, or had she simply sought someone to blame for a life that had broken in too many quiet places? Her throat tightened as the night pressed in, demanding answers none of them were ready to give. Edrin finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying a heaviness that seemed to seep into the walls around them. He didn't accuse. He didn't rage. Instead, he spoke with the quiet clarity of a man who had spent years watching the distance grow between himself and the woman he once hoped to love. His words weren't weapons. They were confessions wrapped in regret. He admitted to his failures, to the way duty had consumed him, to the silence he allowed to settle where affection should have lived. And as he spoke, Isolde felt her knees threaten to buckle, not because he was innocent, but because he was far more broken than she had ever let herself see. Kyle watched the exchange with a tightening in his chest he didn't expect. He had prepared for deceit, manipulation, betrayal, but vulnerability? That was a battlefield he didn't know how to navigate. He could sense Isolde's internal collapse, the way her breath faltered, the way her eyes darted, not to escape, but to understand. Kyle felt an ache rise in him, sharp and unfamiliar. He had stepped into this night believing he was saving a woman from a monster. Now he stood wondering if he'd been pulled into a tragedy, where everyone had been bleeding long before he arrived. That realization cut deeper than any blade he carried. Isolde's voice trembled as she tried to respond, but the words tangled in her throat. She felt torn between the life she had feared and the truth she had refused to face. The walls of her marriage had been cold, yes, but had she helped build them? Had she mistaken her own restlessness for oppression? Her own longing for a cage built by someone else's hands? As these questions clawed at her, she glanced at Kyle, her ally, her risk, her catalyst, and in the flicker of his eyes, she saw the same uncertainty staring back at her, as if they were both standing on the edge of a decision that could either save them or destroy them in a way nothing else had. The air tightened as the silence stretched, thick enough to smother breath. Edrin took a single step closer, not threatening, simply closing the distance that had, for years, felt infinite. His next words came softer, as if he feared they might shatter before they reached her. He spoke of the letters he never sent, the promises he failed to voice, the fear that loving her too openly would cage her even more. And though the lantern light flickered unevenly across his face, Isolde could still see the ache etched into every line, the kind of ache that came not from anger, but from carrying unspoken love until it warped into distance. Kyle felt something twist sharply inside him, a discomfort he didn't dare name. He had been ready to fight a villain, but what stood before him was a man painfully human, painfully earnest, painfully late. For the first time that night, Kale questioned not Isolde's motives or Edrin's intentions, but his own place in the story unfolding between them. He wasn't meant to be here, caught between two hearts that had been cracking long before he arrived, and yet here he was, unable to step back, unable to let go. The realization unsettled him, a subtle but undeniable shift beneath the armor he wore so easily. Isolde's breath came in uneven waves as she struggled to reconcile the man before her with the shadows she had spent years fighting in her mind. Her heart felt torn in too many directions, toward the safety Kale offered, the truth Edrin revealed, and the uncertain path she longed to carve for herself. The weight of the night pressed down on her, urging a choice she wasn't ready to make, but choices rarely waited for readiness. And somewhere in that fragile, trembling moment, Isolde understood that whatever happened next would unravel the last threads tying their lives to what had been. The future, whatever shape it took, would begin now. The night outside the manor had grown colder, as if the world sensed the fracture forming within its walls. Isolde stepped back from the doorway, needing space, needing air, needing something her lungs could cling to that wasn't heavy with confession. Her pulse echoed loudly in her ears, drowning out the soft rustle of curtains and the distant hum of wind. For a fleeting moment, she imagined walking out into the dark, letting the night swallow her before another truth demanded her attention. But footsteps behind her, familiar, purposeful, tethered her to the ground before the impulse could grow into action. Kyle approached her slowly, wary of the storm coiling beneath her skin. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the nearness of him was enough to steady the shaking in her breath. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words felt right in a moment where every emotion was a blade. His eyes flicked toward the Duke, then back to Isolde, searching for a direction, a signal, a reason to draw his next breath with certainty. When she finally met his gaze, the tremor he'd been holding back ran through him. She looked like someone unraveling at the seams, someone who needed saving, even if she no longer knew from whom. Edrin remained in the doorway, watching them with an expression that held no accusation, only the quiet devastation of a man realizing how deeply the fractures between them had run. He didn't call out to her, didn't demand explanations, didn't weaponize the pain she saw flicker in his eyes. Instead, he simply stood there, as if waiting for her to choose the direction of her next step. And for the first time, the weight of that freedom frightened her more than the walls she had once longed to escape. The night pressed closer, dense and breathless. As the three of them hung in the fragile space between truth and consequence, she drew in a slow breath, the kind that trembles on the way in and aches on the way out. All her life, Isolde had mastered the art of composure, chin lifted, spine straight, emotions tucked neatly behind a well-polished facade. But now, standing between two men who had shaped her fate in ways she hadn't fully understood until tonight, that facade cracked in places she couldn't hide. Memories surged up without permission. Edrin's rare moments of gentleness, the first time Chaol had looked at her as if she were more than a title, the endless days pretending she felt nothing while everything inside her burned. It felt as if her past and present were colliding, forcing her to confront the version of herself she had spent years avoiding. Chaol stepped closer, his voice low, almost pleading, though he tried to mask it behind that hardened edge he'd worn like armor for years. "Isolde," he said, and just the sound of her name in his voice made something inside her twist painfully. She felt his conflict as if it were her own, the loyalty he wasn't sure belonged to her, the anger he fought against, the need he could no longer deny. He'd built walls too, ones forged from blood and survival, and she had slipped through the cracks without meaning to. Yet now, with the truth between them, he stood unsure whether to reach for her or retreat into the shadows where feelings were safer, left buried. Edrin's breathing deepened, unsteady, as though he'd aged years in the last few moments. He spoke her name too, but quieter, softer, as if he feared it might shatter in the air. There was regret in his tone, and a kind of sorrow that only comes from realizing too late how much had been left unsaid. She'd always thought him incapable of feeling, a statue carved from political ambition and cold duty. But seeing him now, human, vulnerable, confronting not just her betrayal but his own failures, made the room tilt in ways she hadn't expected. The truth was no longer a weapon. It was a wound they all shared, bleeding into the silence. Isolde felt the pull from both sides, like two currents tugging at the same fragile shore. For a heartbeat, she wished she could split herself in two, one version that had never learned to fear the coldness in Edrin's eyes, and another that had never felt the warmth in Chaol's hands. But life didn't allow such freedoms. Life demanded choices, demanded sacrifice, demanded facing the mirror even when the reflection was painful. Her fingers curled slightly, as if searching for something familiar to anchor her, yet finding nothing steady enough. And in that emptiness, she realized how profoundly alone she had been, even when surrounded by people who claimed to know her. Chaol's jaw tightened, a silent battle playing beneath his expression. He wanted to move, to act, to drag her out of this room and into a future untouched by politics or ghosts. Yet he sensed the fragility in her stance, the way her shoulders trembled with the weight of truths she hadn't spoken aloud. His instincts screamed for action, but his heart, still new to such territory, cautioned patience. So he remained still, waiting, watching, hoping she would trust him enough to choose him, even if the world around them was beginning to crack. And though he didn't speak it, the fear of losing her pressed against his ribs like a blade. Edrin, surprisingly, was the first to break the silence. He didn't raise his voice or lash out. Instead, he asked a single question that landed in the room like a stone dropped into deep water. "What do you want, Isolde?" His voice was steady, but the tremor beneath it carried years of unspoken longing and regret. She flinched, not from the words themselves, but from the realization that she didn't know the answer. Not yet, not with the past tightening around her throat and the future whispering promises she wasn't sure she could trust. And in that suspended moment, the air shifted, hinting that what came next would demand more truth, more courage, and perhaps more heartache than any of them were prepared to face.